we will be making some news today. And joining us today are Mary McCord, Raúl Torrez, and Steven Schulman. They have an important announcement for us. We will also be joined by Michel Signer, who's the former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, and the author of the new book, Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege, and George Selim, the Senior Vice President of Programs at the Anti-Defamation League. I'm Michelle Martin. I'm the weekend host of NPR's All Things Considered. And who would have thought that at the time that we were planning this conversation, that the issues would be as present and as in the news as they are, but here we are. And so I look forward to a rich conversation. You will, of course, have the opportunity to ask questions, and we certainly hope that you will. And today's event is on the record, which is very important to me. But first, we have an announcement from Mary McCord, Legal Director of Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. She's joined today by Raúl Torrez, District Attorney of Bernalillo County, New Mexico, which recently filed suit against the New Mexico Civil Guard for unlawfully usurping law enforcement and military functions during a protest, and Steven Schulman, the pro bono partner at Akin, Gump. Mary McCord, will you please take it away?
Yes, thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. It's been almost 3 years since white supremacist and militia groups descended on Charlottesville, Virginia during the Unite the Right rally. The white supremacist groups were there ostensibly to protest the city's decision to take down Confederate monuments, but in reality, as we learned afterwards, they had very purposefully decided to go to Charlottesville to provoke counter-protesters and unleash violence. The far-right militias were there ostensibly to protect the rights, the First Amendment rights of the protesters, but we learned watching them that what they really were doing was utterly without authority and usurping the legitimate role of peacekeepers and law enforcement. And of course, as we all know, the Unite the Right rally did result in violence and the tragic death of Heather Hauer when a domestic terrorist rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters. Many commentators at the time sort of threw up their hands and said, well, given First and Second Amendment rights, we're limited in what we can do to protect public safety during protest events. But at ICAP, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, my team thought, well, that's not right. The Supreme Court has told us that the First Amendment does not protect violence, nor does it protect incitement to violence. The Supreme Court has told us that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms for one's own individual self-protection, but does not protect paramilitary organizations from organizing themselves to use force and project the ability to use force. And we learned that, in fact, all 50 states have statutes that prohibit private paramilitary activity. So we took that knowledge and we worked with the city of Charlottesville, local small businesses, and residents associations, and we brought a lawsuit. It wasn't for money damages, it was purely to prevent the same type of paramilitary activity and disruption of protests that occurred from happening again in the future. That case was successful and it resulted in court orders prohibiting 23 different white supremacist and militia individuals and organizations from returning to Charlottesville as part of a unit of 2 or more people acting in concert while armed with firearm, shield, or anything that could be used as a weapon during any protest, rally, demonstration, or march. Since that time, ICAP has worked with local jurisdictions, community activists, organizers, concerned residents across the country in cities large and small to help them prepare for protests that they worry will turn violent. Now, I'll be honest, this was motivated by the desire to help cities and help local jurisdictions fight back against white supremacist violent extremism. Most of the inquiries we have gotten over the last 3 years have been from local jurisdictions after they learn that a neo-Nazi march is coming, or a neo-Confederate march is coming, or some other white supremacist event is happening that they can't deny because of the First Amendment, but they are worried about violence, and they seek our help in using state legal authorities, constitutional authorities, to impose content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions on how that speech will take place. That means without paramilitary activity. More recently, though, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and so many other Black and brown people by police across the country, we've had outreach from community members, concerned citizens, and activists who are seeking to engage and organize peaceful protests and are finding those protests disrupted by the same types of far-right militias that ostensibly protected First Amendment rights of the white supremacists in Charlottesville that now claim to be protecting public property, private property, statues, sometimes Confederate, sometimes other racially offensive statutes. These militias often come heavily armed, assault rifles, combat gear, helmets, full military apparatus. They are not only unlawful under state laws that prohibit paramilitary activity, they are reckless, they're dangerous, and they are intimidating to those who seek to engage in First Amendment protected activity. And that's why we've created this toolkit. It's a toolkit that we're announcing today and that will be available at constitutionalprotestguide.com that is filled, and I'll tell you, it's a little wonky. It's filled with legal principles, case law, constitutional law that prescribes the parameters within which local jurisdictions can work in order to protect public safety while preserving important constitutional rights, First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights. But it also has something for the layperson. We have top line bullet points, we have frequently asked questions, we have best practices that are accessible even for activists and community members, and frankly can be used by them to impress upon their elected officials to take action against unlawful militias and those who would seek to inject violence into constitutional and peaceful protests. We're thrilled to also announce today, we realized at ICAP, as the volume of inquiries and requests for assistance has dramatically increased in these last 2 months, we realized we didn't have the resources to respond to all these. And I'm so happy today to be able to announce that Steve Schulman, the pro bono partner at Akin Gump, he and his firm took on the task of bringing together a coalition of nationwide and regional law firms that have all agreed and committed to work with local jurisdictions, activists, communities to help protect public safety while preserving constitutional rights. That the work of the law firm coalition and ICAP will help to elevate efforts by local officials like Raúl Torrez, the Bernalillo, New Mexico County District Attorney, who just last month paired with ICAP to bring a lawsuit, as Michel just indicated, a lawsuit against the New Mexico Civil Guard, a heavily armed militia that sought to protect the statute of a Spanish conquistador that protesters wanted to come down. Heavily armed, they added intimidation and tension and violence to the situation there. That lawsuit was modeled on our suit in Charlottesville, and that's the kind of proactive leadership that we're looking to support through our efforts at ICAP and those of the law firm coalition. The increased calls, the increased needs in this polarized time are why we're here today. We want to have a conversation about how communities can combat political violence and extremism. And we want to make sure that in doing so, that we elevate the democratic ideals that provide all people, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your ideology, the ability to exercise your First Amendment rights peaceably and without violence. With that, I'm happy to turn things over to District Attorney Torrez.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Thank you, Mary, for that introduction, and welcome to the panelists and participants in this important conversation. I want to start by really acknowledging the work of ICAP and their team in assisting us in what is sort of complex legal terrain. It's certainly not something that I, as a career prosecutor, or most of the prosecutors in my office, imagined we would be engaged in. when we came into office just a few years ago. But I'd also like to take a moment to reflect on, frankly, why I felt it was important to push back and to try to, frankly, reclaim some space for foundational institutions and principles in our democracy. I will defer, as I should, to the real First and Second Amendment scholars, to Steve, to Mary, and to the folks at ICAP about the real complex parameters of the work that we're engaged in and the things that we're trying to do. But I think it's important to understand our motivation. And I think for me personally, what it really comes down to is this notion that what makes this country and this republic a special place, with all its flaws and all its, so I think deficiencies or things that we have failed to live up to. We have always had this notion that the institutions and the principles that are enshrined in the Constitution and elsewhere will endure. But when I look back and I think about different times in our history, those things have only endured because we have been willing to refresh and renew our commitment every generation in an evolving context. And to a certain extent, we're always an unfinished project. It's been interesting since we filed this lawsuit for us to have a conversation about how novel it is for us to step in as a district attorney's office and say forcefully that you can't form your own paramilitary unit, you can't act as an unauthorized law enforcement unit, and that you can't threaten other members of the public. But I think a lot of that has to do with the notion that what we're doing is novel, when in fact, I think it's threaded throughout our foundational documents. It's found in our core principles, this notion of a well-regulated militia, the notion that not everyone and not every disaffected group in our society has the authority or the ability to empower itself, to silence others, to stifle dissent, and to act in ways that threaten public safety. And so in a sense, we're rediscovering tools that we have not used, and we certainly haven't deployed in the fight against extremism in some time. But these are things that are well established in our law. But it's important too, I think, as folks in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of social unrest and all that's going on in our country, that we do everything that we can to kind of restore faith in the institutions. And a lot of times we look to Washington, we look to Congress, we look to the White House for that kind of leadership, when in fact, there are tools available to local leaders to renew at a local level the commitments to those larger founding principles. And that's what has sort of motivated me to engage in this work, to file the lawsuit that we filed in partnership with ICAP. And I'm extremely proud to have formed that partnership. And I hope other jurisdictions and other leaders around the country will understand that if they are willing to step forward and take on that leadership role, that there are partners at Georgetown and in this coalition of law firms around the country that have the technical expertise and the resources to help reestablish the proper limits of what should be normal political discourse in this country. And so with that, as a background, I really hope that this is the beginning and not the end of an important movement across this country to renew our commitment to those ideals. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Raúl. And Mary, to paraphrase Renee Zellweger in Jerry Maguire, you had me at wonky. This has been a great opportunity for us at Akin Gump and our partner law firms to engage in real substantial work that is going to have an impact and already has had an impact, as you heard from Raúl Torrez, around the country. Several weeks ago, Mary and her colleagues at ICAP approached us to think through how to deal with the rise around the country of armed militias that are frankly trying to intimidate protesters and engaging in extrajudicial violence. As we learned more about this paramilitary activity, it was immediately clear that we needed to form a coalition of law firms to respond. That this isn't one thing is that Akin Gump could just do, as proud as I am of our law firm. We are not spread all around the country, and we certainly do not have monopoly on expertise here. And so in part as my role as Akin Gump's pro bono partner and also as the co-president of the Association of Pro Bono Counsel, an organization of 260 law firm pro bono leaders of more than 130 law firms, we quickly reached out to other law firms, Wilmer Hale, Hogan Lovells, O'Melveny, Jones Day, Stoll Reeves, Gibson Dunn, Dykema, so that we had both geographic coverage and also expertise coverage around the country. As Mary has said and Raúl nodded to, this is an emerging area of law. It is an area of statutory law, of constitutional law, of tort law, but this is not, as Raúl said so well, a novel issue. This is recommitting to the underpinnings of the rule of law. This is the promise that we have made in this country is that the monopoly on policing and the use of force belongs to the state. It does not belong to roving bands of individuals who take it upon themselves to enforce what they view as the law. And so as lawyers, there is no more important duty than to ensure that the rule of law is honored and respected around the country. And as Raúl said, there are many local officials and law enforcement personnel who are quite worried about this rise in what is frankly, again, a novel area of the law and need support and need law firms to get up to speed on this. As Mary said, the toolkit is released today. It is more than 120 pages long. It can be quite wonky, and so that is why we need lawyers to join in. I am extraordinarily thrilled that we are going to be doing a training next week on this. Certainly we have initially a group of firms that have signed on, but this is not by any means an exclusive list. We intend to keep recruiting law firms to get engaged in this important work. What we have found so far is that this is particularly attractive to former prosecutors who have dealt with similar issues and obviously feel very strongly about ensuring that the rule of law continues. So Mary, thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to do this. And Raúl, it was a pleasure to hear your words as well. Thank you.
All right, let's open this up. Let's see, we should be opening up the video with all groups now. Okay. Hello, Mary, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Okay,
great. Well, let's talk about how do you keep this content neutral? I mean, this is a really timely conversation. And we're going to talk more about this when we speak with Mike Signer later about his book about it and his experiences in Charlottesville. One of the things that I learned in reading his book about the events in Charlottesville, in part because I don't live there, although I know many people who do, is that these sort of, the Unite the Right rally is the one that we're most acquainted with. But in fact, these neo-Nazi groups and these kind of white supremacist groups had been gathering in Charlottesville for quite some time before the events that we all now know. And I'm assuming that the same thing was happening in New Mexico, and I'm going to ask Raúl Torrez to talk about that. But the reason I raise that is that what's front and center in a lot of people's minds right now are the anti-police violence rallies that are going on in cities across the country, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. So how do you ensure that this is content neutral? Because as I think everyone knows, the president and the attorney general are deeply disturbed, they seem to be, by the anti-police violence rallies that are going on around the country. They haven't seemed to have been as disturbed by these armed militias invading, say, the Michigan State Capitol or engaging in this other conduct. As the president, famously told us, there are good people on both sides of those conflicts, evidently, but apparently not now here. So how do you ensure that these are content neutral means that are being used to address circumstances that you and obviously other leaders believe are strongly disposed to lead to violence?
Yes, so I'll take that on first and then happy to hear from others. So it was very important to us, of course, when we worked with Mike and others in Charlottesville to bring the case there, to make clear to the court and to the public that this lawsuit was based on conduct, not the content of any ideology or any viewpoint. And so the tools we use, these anti-paramilitary tools, are based on conduct. So 48 out of the 50 states have a constitutional provision that requires the military to be strictly subordinate to civilian authority. The idea is public accountability for the use of force. All 50 states have elaborate regimes by which the governor can call forth the militia, but no one else. And all law enforcement in every state is subject to governmental oversight and reserved to governmental entities. Now, we may have some gripes right now about some of the law enforcement forces across the country, and those are very legitimate complaints, which protesters are rightfully out protesting about. But the kind of laws that we're focusing on here and that we focus on in the toolkit, in addition to others, are based on conduct that is violent and that is not protected by the Constitution. And it really doesn't matter whether it's right-wing, left-wing, non-ideological. If it's paramilitary conduct, that's unlawful in all of the states.
Raúl Torrez, can you pick up that thread there, please? And so talk a little bit more, if you would, about the environment that these groups are creating. I mean, I sometimes think, and I'll just, disclose, look, I come from a law enforcement family. I have 6 police officers in my family, going, over, 2 generations, actually 3 generations. And it has often struck me that some parts of the country don't find the open presence of weapons as disturbing as some parts of the country do. But it is also the case that, white terrorist violence directed at people of color is not something that this country has always taken seriously or even acknowledged as the terroristic action that it is. I mean, it's been largely invisible for so much of our history, at least it's invisible to everybody but the victims of it, right? So could you just describe what the environment is and what your constituents tell you about what how it makes them feel, or what response it evokes in them to see these kinds of militia groups come to their communities?
Sure. I think, Michelle, like you, I grew up in a family that's got a long history in law enforcement. I grew up around police officers. My dad's one of the longest serving federal prosecutors here in the state. But I also grew up in a place where I got my first firearm when I was 11 years old. This is as part of just in a state that is this rural, this wide open. People are accustomed to seeing firearms around, and this is an open carry state. So, you always have that in the background, this notion that I would imagine in a lot of urban environments where if you saw people walking around with long guns, it would be, something that would actually just shock the conscience. Here, it's disturbing, but it's not something that it's not something you've never seen before in your life. The other interesting component to what's happening here in Albuquerque is the origins of this particular protest that brought people out. This has to do with an individual who was one of the first conquistadors to New Mexico in 1598, and atrocities that were committed against an indigenous population here, nearly 400 years ago. So we're operating in a different context. But the elements of some of the confrontations that you have seen throughout the country are also present, meaning you have people who on the left feel very strongly about that legacy. They, in this particular instance, they showed up because they wanted that statue of this individual taken down. It started off as a peaceful prayer, actually, that evolved over time when more aggressive folks decided they were actually going to physically remove it. The New Mexico Civil Guard and people on the right had been monitoring those chat rooms and the social media, and they decided to come and interpose themselves between those protesters and the statue. I think one of the difficult things from my perspective is the way in which the armed militias actually foster violence, even though there is a claim that they will prevent violence. And that's done because a lot of other people in the crowd, agitators and others who come to that specific, place and time decide, well, there are lots of people on my team who they have an AR-15, they're ready to back me up, so I can push things and engage in violent conduct beyond what I probably would if we were all there unarmed. And so that context is a deadly one. And the other thing that informs my perspective on it is my dad spent a lot of time as the legal attaché in Colombia. And the history of that country, and frankly, sadly, of a lot of countries in Latin America, is one where disaffected groups on the left and disaffected groups on the right decide that they can't achieve their political or policy aim through the normal legislative and institutional process. So they form their own competing military units, and they eventually, if left unchecked, will engage in that kind of combat and warfare. Thankfully, we have largely avoided that in this country, but we are I think, at a dangerous moment in our history if we don't step forward as institutional checks on that authority. But the last point I would make on one that Mary emphasized is this is about conduct. It's not about your political beliefs. It's not about you being on the left or the right. It's about whether or not you're armed, organizing, training, and holding yourself out as a paramilitary unit. And as Steve said, trying to exercise force when only the government has a monopoly on force. And that is written throughout our civil complaint, which is for all of the problems that we have right now with law enforcement and their misconduct and their use of force. We at least have the benefit of knowing that they have been vetted, they have been screened, they have been trained, they aren't felons. Right? There's a basic standard that we hold as going through this vetting process. And when you allow groups to take it upon themselves to do that, you don't know who's going to be there. You don't know who's going to be engaged in that activity. And that's a dangerous situation.
As briefly as you can, I do want to get a question into Steven before we bring in the other panelists. Do most of your constituents buy into that vision? As you pointed out, that there are some parts of the country where people carrying visible weapons is just more normal than in others, whether or not we think that's a good idea or not. I mean, that's right. That's a conversation that we are all going to have some other time. But do most of your constituents buy into the notion that people displaying these weapons and presenting themselves in this manner has the potential for violence, no matter what side of the political equation that they're on? Do you sense that most people get that?
Yeah, I think that there is broad consensus in this community, and frankly in this country, for the notion that it is not for self-appointed armed groups to mediate conflict, because we all know that eventually it will break into the open, into combat, into armed conflict. And so even if you disagree with the protesters, I don't think most people who disagree with the protesters would decide, oh, the militia is the appropriate response to reining that in. I will say that there is probably on the other side of that spectrum, of that political and ideological spectrum, a notion that if the police and local law enforcement is not able to safeguard people and property, that does create a space for these people to operate, which is, well, I have to defend myself and I have to protect others. And that's why it's incumbent on local law enforcement to have the trust of their constituents and operate in very tough dynamic environments without breaking that trust, so that everyone can view them as neutral arbiters of public safety and law enforcement. And that's another conversation we need to have some other time, and probably for many years to come right now. Okay, look forward to that. Steven Schulman, before we let you go, thank you for joining us as well. I think it's pretty well known that most law firms are politically diverse, at least the large law firms are politically diverse. And I'm interested in how you persuade your colleagues, and particularly colleagues at other firms, that this is the right thing to do. I mean, I'm sure that you have an array of opinions, both in your firm and in the other firms that you've invited to join this coalition, about the role of guns in our society, about various sort of political movements. And I'm just interested in how you
because I think that the argument that you make to law firms is the same argument or the same conversation one wants to have with the public. Why is this in their interest to participate in? Why is this a good thing to do? Why is this toolkit necessary at this time?
Right. So it's a very acute question, and it is one that we paid very much attention to. That obviously right now the majority of what we're seeing is, as Mary put it, right-wing violence, but there certainly has been some left-wing violence as well. Unfortunately, the fellow who was killed in Austin last week was with the protesters and was carrying an automatic weapon, and that appears to have led to his death. We were very careful in the way that we discussed this with our colleagues. In fact, my first partner who decided to join on had served in the George W. Bush administration and was anything but a liberal. And in fact, I think we saw as we reached out to law firms around the country that this was something that really struck at the heart of the rule of law, and it was very personal to lawyers that we hold as a core value the respect for the way that our constitutional system works. And as Raúl has said, it works by the state having a monopoly on force. And we certainly are right now in a time, as Mary has said, where it appears that there are more right-wing militias. But as Raúl said, it's not a far step from if both sides feel that they are not being heard, and there is space allowed for armed militias. It is not a left-wing or right-wing thing to be armed as a matter of kind of the arc of history, right? It is not something that you would permanently say, well, that's a conservative value or a liberal value. It is something that is unfortunately a recognition or a symbol of a breakdown of civil society. And that's what we are trying to make sure that we don't have happen here. It is a first step towards, frankly, anarchy if we allow privately run militias to do things like guarding public property. That is the job of the police. And the police don't do it perfectly, but it is their job to do it, and we can hold them accountable. And the problem with armed militias who try to usurp that power is there are very few ways to hold them accountable after the fact in a way that is satisfactory to the public and doesn't lead to the situations that Raúl was talking about. So thankfully, I think our law firms all understand that this is a rule of law issue. It is not a right-wing issue. It's not a left-wing issue. It is really about making sure that we preserve our constitutional order.
That's Steven Schulman, who is pro bono partner at Akin Gump. And we also heard from Raúl Torrez, who's the district attorney of Bernalillo County, New Mexico, who recently filed suit against the New Mexico Civil Guard for, as we said, unlawfully usurping law enforcement and military functions during a protest at the statue of the Juan de On. And thank you both so much for joining this conversation. I hope you can stick around for the rest of it. We're going to bring in Mike Signer. Now, Mary McCord is staying with us, and Mike Signer, the former mayor of Charlottesville, is going to join us. And George Selim of the Anti-Defamation League is going to join us. And I do want to mention that some of you are already doing this, that you can submit questions. You send your name, affiliation, and question through the chat, and we will save ample time to address your questions. And I certainly hope you will. I mean, at this time when we are all sort of physically distanced, it's nice to have some opportunity to interact, however, sort of, not as fun as it would be if we were all together. So we're going to talk for a few minutes, and I just wanted to ask about your relationship with the history of this extremism. I mean, Mr. Mayor Michael Signer, you're an historian in addition to having been a mayor and a sort of practitioner. And George, you've had a long sort of career around sort of public policy. So I'm going to go to you, George, just sort of briefly and talk, if you would, about the history of this kind of extremism especially, I don't want to say especially right-wing, I do want to say especially right-wing extremism that is sort of visible, sort of present in the current moment, and how this moment compares as briefly as you can.
Sure. So, Michel, I'll just start with a textual definition of the term violent extremism, which is ideologically motivated violence to further a political goal, which is just a little bit different than the actual definition of terrorism itself. And the difference there is the role of the ideology. So whether that ideology is inspired by a foreign group in some form or factor, or is domestic in nature, what we've seen from August of 2017, from Charlottesville through today, and what we've seen in just the in the 2 decades nearly since 9/11, is we've seen an increase in violent extremism across this country, irrespective of the ideology. Most recently, what we've seen, and ADL has 4 decades worth of kind of documenting these instances, what we've seen most recently in the past decade is we've seen a serious uptick both in anti-Semitic incidents, and we've seen a considerable uptick in violence and acts of domestic terror that are inspired or perpetrated in the name of white nationalist or white supremacist ideology. So to give you a tight answer, kind of that's the bullet point.
Michael Signer, let's go to you now. I want to go back to the book, and I thought it was important that you pointed out, and this is something I am embarrassed that I did not know until I read your book, was how long these incidents had been taking place in Charlottesville before the one that captured the nation's attention. So could you just start there and talk a little bit about that? Like what set this off?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and it's very flattering to be with this incredible group. So the reason I think the story of Charlottesville is so important is it illuminates the limits of the status quo for all cities dealing with this time of colliding extremism across the political spectrum. So that's why this kind of in-depth story of Charlottesville is told in the book, I think, is so relevant. When I look around now, the recent events in Albuquerque, the civic unrest and political violence, Albuquerque, Cortland, Richmond, they're very worrisome, but they're as worrisome as the political assassinations and kind of individual terrorist acts that we've seen in El Paso and Pittsburgh and San Bernardino. And what happened in Charlottesville was you had 3 white nationalist events in 2017. So there were 2 others that came before the one that everybody knows about, the Unite the Right rally, which was in August of 2017. Richard Spencer, who founded the term alt-right and who is a UVA graduate, came with 100 of his followers with tiki torches to go to the Robert E. Lee statue in this flash mob that was a terrorizing event in May of 2017. And then a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, modern day, came from North Carolina in July, and with an event that was reminiscent of a lot of these conflicts we've seen around the country. There were like 1,000 counter protesters that came. There were clashes afterward with police. There was tear gas used, and that all set the stage for this really unbelievable event that happened in August. And the story of what happened in the kind of nitty gritty of a local government seeking to handle this series of awful events. In that same year, keep in mind, Portland and Berkeley also had a number of clashes between white nationalists and far left groups, and they also had incredible difficulty dealing with them. At one point, the mayor of Berkeley, very progressive guy, proposed classifying Antifa as a gang. Meanwhile, you had these very violent right-wing groups coming and doing a lot of what they're doing right now. And I thought I would tell a couple of details just because it gets so into the story, and it's so similar when you look at the status quo for all these cities. We have a city manager form of government in Charlottesville where the city manager is the emergency manager for the city. He and the police chief had tried to concoct a plan to handle a couple thousand of far left and far right people coming on the heels of these 2 other very conflictual events. Meanwhile, at that same time, so they thought they had a security plan that could handle it with a city of 50,000 people. Meanwhile, at that same time, the University of Virginia hospital canceled all elective surgeries because they were looking at this from a public health perspective and saying, we just think that there's such a potential for violence and harm that we're gonna clear the decks at the hospital just looking at the odds of danger and death. Okay, so the elected officials, in another kind of case study of just cities trying to work on this, the city members of city council, led by me, and I tell this agonizing story in the book, we overruled the police chief and the city manager and hired an outside law firm to try and relocate the rally to a different location where there could have been green space between the counter protesters and the protesters, because of the nature of existing First Amendment law. And this is why this ICAP toolkit is so extraordinary, so helpful, because it can help cities pick their way through. We had during this time 3 overworked lawyers in our general counsel's office for a city of 50,000 people dealing with a couple thousand people. And again, this is happening all around the country when you look at these cities that are being rocked by this kind of tumult. So we intervened, as I tell this story in the book. The ACLU sued us with this plan to try to relocate the rally. We lost in federal court on the eve of the rally with this attempt to move the statue to a safer location away from the Robert E. Lee statue. And during all of this time, as Mary points out, the Second Amendment and a state law in Virginia forbade the city from regulating firearms or ammunition at this event, which people were. It was mind-boggling, but that was the case of law in a anti-home rule state like Virginia. So you had all of these forces conspiring to make this the worst that it could have been. And before we get to any questions, I just wanted to tell you, so there was this, the Department of Homeland Security through the Virginia Fusion Center authored a confidential memo. This is Wednesday before the event is scheduled to happen. We were in litigation at that time with the ACLU, with the small law firm, and we with the small lawyer office that we had, and we were about to lose in federal court. The Fusion Center authored a memorandum that said domestic terrorist violence at lawfully permitted white supremacist rallies likely to continue. And it said this article is intended to alert law enforcement to the potential for violence at future white supremacist rallies, including one planned for this Saturday in Charlottesville. We assess that this rally could be among the most violent to date. Anarchist extremists and white supremacist extremists online are calling for supporters to be prepared for or to instigate violence at this rally. For instance, a probable white supremacist posted online a call to arms, Antifa must be destroyed. Despite that being created, it never made its way into the litigation that was happening, and it didn't make its way into the planning that the small town officials were doing at the last gasp. And this is all, when I look at what's happening around the country as city after city after city is trying to deal with militias invading and conflicting with protests, peaceful protests of thousands of people, some of them not peaceful. This is a snapshot of the breakdown that's happening with the formal government if we don't have the tools that ICAP is aiming to give us, which is basically innovating and creating democratic resilience from within the norms and institutions we have, and being creative.
How exactly though? That's just because what you're describing. Talk a little bit more about what difference this would actually have made. Because what I read from what you told us is that, first of all, the Homeland Security took it seriously belatedly, even though this had been going on for some time. So it seemed that they took it seriously at the 11th hour. Thing one, and also that the law tied your hands, and also one could make an argument that in particular the form of governance in Charlottesville, forgive me, is ill-suited to addressing these kinds of emergencies. So what exactly would have made a difference now that you've had a bit of time to think about it and reflect on it and hopefully get your blood pressure back down?
It's a great question. So I think that the government, public policy is about solving tricky problems, no matter how bad the facts are. And when Mary called me like 4 days, it was a few days after the Unite the Right rally, and said, we have this idea based on an article that Philip Zelikow had written about filing a lawsuit to prevent the city from having organized militias invade. At that very time, Richard Spencer was actively saber rattling and saying, I'm going to make Charlottesville's head spin. We're going to be back so often. You're going to be the center of the world. They did a flash mob in October again. The Proud Boys were coming back. And then there was the 1-year anniversary where a permit had already been filed for an anniversary, which could have been much more violent. So to me, the value in this, with all those facts of dysfunction and the form of government, is that this is the rule of law saying the prime cause underneath all of this was people feeling comfortable. Over 10 militias came to Charlottesville armed and constituting themselves like a paramilitary group. They had uniforms, they went on sorties into neighborhoods, they had command structures, they came in on buses, they had areas they were protecting, they were prepared to do battle, but they also knew the current First Amendment, which is if they described their actions defensively, if they said, if Antifa comes after me, we're gonna bash their heads in. That, under the current First Amendment, is protected because it's described defensively. It's not a planned imminent act. So my point is that we need ideas like this, and this worked. At the 1-year anniversary of Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally, there were no militias there because Mary had gotten, and her team had gotten binding consent decrees where they had agreed, they had come into court, they had lawyers, they had agreed not to come back to Charlottesville because the law was against them. So I think that what's happening in Albuquerque, it's an amazing story, and there ought, in this incredibly frightening time where you have organized political violence, marshaling these militia statutes against militias is one thing. You also have a whole host of learnings about how to be much more proactive, better prepared, more aggressive, using this hard-earned wisdom from cities like Charlottesville. And I have more to say about that. I've been consulting with other mayors and elected officials in the last in the last month in Minnesota and Idaho and California with lessons from Charlottesville about how to handle these conflictual events. But start with the big stuff, which is militias should not be permitted to invade towns, period. That would have made Charlottesville a lot safer, and it did at the 1-year anniversary.
So let's talk about this. We have a lot of questions that are coming in, and I hope that we can actually get to as many as we can. But I think, why don't we sort of pivot to a question about Louisville here, because there's a question from a reporter in Louisville, Kentucky, who asks if you could talk about the recent militia activity in Louisville. The city has had frequent, I'm reading the question here, this is not my reporting, so I'm trusting the reporting of the person asking the question, if I could just say that. The city has had frequent presence of right-wing, mostly white militias during protests over the killing of Breonna Taylor, but on Saturday, an armed Black militia also came to Louisville, and some see the NFAC, this is what this group is, as a protective presence, but the leader of the NFAC urged people to take up arms. So can you talk about whether you see this as different from right-wing militia and whether the toolkit is applicable in this case as well? So Mary, do you want to start with that?
Sure, and I appreciate the question and expected that someone would ask about Louisville. And in fact, I sent a letter on behalf of ICAP to Louisville officials yesterday, calling their attention to the anti-militia laws that are on the books in Kentucky, and recognizing that in that case, we had both right-wing militias and left-wing militias. And as we discussed earlier, these laws are based on conduct, not on the ideology behind them. Okay. And although, you know, I may personally share more in common with the ideology that's motivating the NFAC left-wing militia in terms of the fact that they are protesting against racial injustice, their methods of doing that by engaging in this armed paramilitary activity and actually even threatening violence are the same types of dangerous and unlawful techniques that the right-wing militias engaged in. And so there and elsewhere. Now and I can understand why this group might say, look, we've seen right-wing militias, including, as you mentioned, Michel, those that stormed the state houses in Michigan and elsewhere at the beginning of the pandemic to demand, you know, that the stay-at-home orders be lifted. And the president encouraged that activity, and officials did not squash that activity. I can understand why a left-wing group would say, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We're going to do the same thing. I understand that. And it was wrong for that activity not to be you know, challenged in Michigan and Minnesota and elsewhere. And it's wrong for the activity not to be challenged now by local officials, whether it's right-wing activity or left-wing activity. And so one of the reasons we wrote this letter yesterday, and we've written similar letters to local officials in Idaho and in Virginia and elsewhere, is to call attention to the statutes. Because I think one thing that has happened over the years is there's a notion, a mythology out there about the Second Amendment, particularly in open carry states. There's a mythology that means you can carry a weapon anytime for whatever purpose in any way, including as part of a militia. And that is exactly the opposite of what the Supreme Court has said as recently in 2008, where it reaffirmed a decision from the late 1800s, making crystal clear that the Second Amendment does not prevent states from prohibiting paramilitary organizations.
Well, but this is, well, maybe this is where I'll go, but I have to go back to something here, Mary, is to something you said, is that people only seem to get upset when Black people start carrying guns. Okay, and this is the issue here that I think, and Michael, you faced this as mayor of Charlottesville, because when you tried to get the, as I recall, support of some of the progressive groups in town and to get them to give intelligence about what they were hearing and seeing, they refused to do it because they felt that the elected officials in Charlottesville had no right to this. You were trying to interfere in their affairs. But so, Mary, I just have to say, the history of it seems to be that white people walking around with large weapons seem to be able to operate with quite a lot of impunity. And it seems to only get the attention of federal officials in particular when Black people emulate that behavior. And so if people would say to you, what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I'm one of the people who for 3 years have been trying to beat the drum that white militias with big, long guns are illegal. And it pains me to now see other groups, taking up arms, because when you look at the situation in Louisville, you had the NFAC, I think all, if not primarily all, Black militia group. You had a right-wing 3%er militia group, heavily armed. And then you had an in-between them police in riot control in order to maintain order in the situation. I mean, this is not protest in America. This is not a peaceful assertion of First Amendment rights, right? This is not what we want to protect. This is reckless and it's dangerous. And in fact, 3 people were shot, not purposefully, but by accident, it appears, when someone's weapon discharged in the NFAC group, which just shows you the dangerousness of this type of activity. And so, my response is I really want to educate people. Let's go back to understanding that under the rule of law, private militias just are unlawful. They're not safe, and they are dangerous, and they threaten First Amendment activity rather than foster First Amendment activity. And I respect the viewpoints of the NFAC. I would love to talk with the NFAC and see them being able to channel their efforts another way. But I understand why they might say, why should we back down when the white militias aren't backing down? And I think that's why, this toolkit's important. Getting the word out there is important. It is not okay. It's wrong for the president to encourage it. He did it with his Liberate tweets a couple of months ago, and I wrote separately about that in the Washington Post. It's wrong for local officials. Some local officials do implicitly, if not explicitly, encourage this activity, particularly in some rural and red areas. And this is just, I think we need to educate people. This is unlawful. It's unlawful no matter the color of your skin, and it's unlawful no matter the ideology behind it. Let's get back to being able to foster actual peaceful protest. And so
Go ahead. I was going to ask George a question before we get to some more questions. George, I think most people paying attention have become acquainted with the rise in anti-Semitic incidents in recent years. Do you have a sense of what percentage of those are attached to these kinds of militia-like movements? I think it was a shock to some people when at the Unite Your Right rally, these marchers were spewing anti-Semitic tropes. It wasn't a shock to people who live in Charlottesville because Jewish religious institutions had been sort of targeted by these people in these kind of drive-by intimidation tactics. But George, just giving us the big picture here, what do you have a sense of what role these groups are playing in this increase in anti-Semitic incidents around the country?
So I'll try to answer that question in 2 parts. One way is in the real world context. Another way is in the online context. When you think about the instances, the horrific acts of domestic terror in Pittsburgh, in Poway, in Muncie, in Jersey City, or even in El Paso, Orlando, Garlic Gilroy Festival. These weren't acts of domestic terror that were committed by large-scale militias. These were individuals, but they were inspired, radicalized, and mobilized by this form of insidious ideology that started online. And you see the manifestos, and you see the citations of Anders Breivik from Europe and others. So you see the citations across the board where this ideology has really inspired individual and lone wolf actors, not always in the case of a kind of a large-scale mob like we saw in Charlottesville. In fact, what we saw in Charlottesville is the minority, not the majority. The overwhelming majority is individual or very small sets of individuals, but all the instances I just mentioned were perpetrated by individuals, not groups.
And that leads to another question we have from the audience. This is from Tom, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Kutch, who's the news editor at The Trace. And his question is, in order to prosecute armed paramilitary behavior, what kind of legal standard do you suggest to distinguish armed persons acting as a militia versus armed persons acting of their own volition who say they are not part of a militia? Does this hinge on determining organizational affiliation, or is it an in-the-moment determination about how the individual behavior might reasonably be perceived? I think that's an important question, because I'm not sure, going back to the Michigan example, I'm not sure if those individuals had a command structure, or if they just were like-minded individuals who all were heavily armed, who happened to show up there. So, Mary, do you want to start, and then Michael, perhaps you can. And
yeah, and I have something to add, but
okay,
Mary,
Michael, go ahead.
Well, I'll say a quick point, but Mary, I think it's more substantive for you to answer. I just wanted to address back to the question, Michelle, that you asked earlier about the span of this activity. It was for the elected officials in Charlottesville, there was a crucial early decision that came to us with joining this litigation, which was, would we include the left-wing organized paramilitary groups that had come to Charlottesville? There was one called Redneck Revolt, which was armed and equipped like a militia in the same way. It had a command structure. They brandished weapons. They had uniforms. And our decision, and it was tough because at that point, if you look at the sympathies, I mean, I've joked, I mean, who of us would not want to be considered an anti-fascist? But when you look at the backdrop of this question is in this time of Trumpism and throwing fuel on fires and increasing political legitimation of political violence and violent extremism across the board, drawing a hard line and saying that this is unacceptable. And we, by the way, have a law against it. So we did include Redneck Revolt. It was tough. There was a lot of heat about it, but it was the right thing to do. And it goes to say, these were all white militias, by the way. So going to your point, the incredible distrust, which is a big part of the book and is part of the nitty gritty of this story, which you see all around the country right now too, in Minneapolis and Portland and other places. It is necessary for officials to address. They have to build bridges however they can to communities that rightfully are mistrustful of them in rebuilding the center of the civic governance policing nexus that can actually keep us safe in this time. So I wanted to just say that these were ideologically diverse white militias that this story was about taking a stand against. But Mary, over to you on the actual legal standards.
So that's a question that I get asked all the time. And the thing is, none of the constitutional provisions, none of the anti-militia statutes really clearly defined what's the difference between a militia and a bunch of individuals who happen to be armed in an open carry state for their own individual self-protection. And there's no statutory list of factors. But that's why when we brought the case in Charlottesville and again in New Mexico, we're looking for sort of like the strongest indicia that this is organized and coordinated militia activity and not just individuals. And it doesn't mean everyone has to be part of one group. In Charlottesville, we saw militia groups coming from New York, Pennsylvania, as far away as Washington State and other states, multiple militias that all joined together. But on that day, they operated under a commander and a deputy commander who were named, and people knew they were the one calling the shots. You could tell the way they deployed. They were in specific formation at a certain distance apart from each other as they deployed to protect the protesters. And they wore uniforms. Now they weren't all matching because they were from different militias, but they were all in some type of fatigues with combat flak jackets and helmets and all kinds of military gear and combat boots, and then usually had their insignia, whether it was 3%ers or Lightfoot or whatever it was, they wore their insignia. So I think what we look for to sort of differentiate is, are they operating together? Are they coordinating together? Are they purporting either to coordinate to protect property or protect individuals, engage in that unlawful usurpation of legitimate peacekeeping and law enforcement authority? Or are they just individuals who, happen to be at the event on their own, not working with anybody, not coordinating with anybody, and happen to have a weapon? And so I also want to make clear that, litigation is one tool. We used it with the city of Charlottesville. We're working with Raúl Torrez in Albuquerque. There may be other jurisdictions where litigation is appropriate. I've consulted with activists in various places. But that is not the only way these tools can be used. Again, when a city has advance notice of an event, either because they require a permit for the event and a permit's been applied for, or because the organizers, have made it clear they're coming, the cities can use these laws to put certain restrictions on activities, including barring paramilitary activity. Now, as Mike mentioned earlier, unfortunately, a number of states prohibit individual cities from taking any kind of action that would restrict firearms carrying. And so and they do that under a law that says, if you're sued for violating this and you lose, you have to pay attorney's fees and damages and all these kind of things. It's very draconian. So many local jurisdictions are terrified to ban firearms, even from events where they expect warring factions. It's like crazy. Mind-blowing. In fact, in Virginia, the legislature recently changed the law so that local jurisdictions can prohibit firearms during events. But even with those laws in place, none of those laws prohibit a jurisdiction from banning paramilitary activity during an event.
I have two more questions, and I do want to hope if I could save a couple of minutes left for closing thoughts, if you could sort of tighten up our next answers. I want to give you all a chance to kind of leave us or conclude our event with with some closing sort of thoughts. So this, and the next question actually, Mary, really follows up on that. Does it have to be a city to file the lawsuit? To whom can the lawsuit be filed? What about loose, broad organizations such as 3%er, Oath Keepers, and the like? Does the city have to be the agent of this? And then I have a question from Mike after you answer, Mary, if I may.
Sure. So it depends on the state. And so in our Charlottesville litigation, we had local businesses who were plaintiffs. We had the city that was a plaintiff, and we had residential associations. In Albuquerque, the district attorney is bringing this under his authority as the district attorney. So this is one of the legal wonky aspects of this. In any lawsuit, you have to have standing to be able to show specific concrete injury to the plaintiff in order to proceed with your lawsuit. So in most cases, a city will have that type of standing, but in some cases, individuals or businesses or others who are harmed by the activity may also have standing. So that's the kind of questions, frankly, that we look forward to, along with Steven Schulman and Akin, Gump, and all the law firm partners, to help people with when they're assessing their options, is be able to talk through, okay, under your law in your state, how could we address this, and who could have standing if litigation is even an appropriate option.
So Michael, here's a question I think that people would like to hear from you. I know that, like a number of other public officials or people who have been in this experience, you don't really like to talk about the impact on you and on your family. I do think it would be, if you don't mind, I would like to ask, what was that like? I mean, the fact is, to confront these militia groups, even legally, can be quite challenging. I'll just sort of put it that way. So would you mind sharing a little bit about what it was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was harrowing, and it was, I mean, the adjectives, there's a lot, and I don't want to bore everybody with my psychological history that would, everybody brings their own story up to the point in which they get involved in anything, but whatever factors, I'm not somebody who's incredibly comfortable with a lot of fighting around me anyway, and a lot of anger. And so you have politics today has a lot of that. So that's already, but to, you know, I talk in the book about just wrestling with the different aspects of this. There was the part of me that wanted to solve problems in a pretty rational way. And then you were faced with these Gordian knots that were impossible, and these paradoxes that were just, it made you crazy making. Then there was me. Then there were the parts that were about being attacked as a Jewish public official, and these attacks were very specific and insidious. I mean, somebody sent, you know, getting handwritten cards to my house that were meant to get in my mind and troll me personally, not to mention the onslaught of online, and figuring out how to pick the ADL was unbelievably helpful. And it moves me now thinking about the first call I got from the ADL to be a resource to elected officials dealing with this. The disappointment when you have the far left in a liberal town, which Charlottesville is, which wants you to stand against these kinds of groups no matter what. And as I talk in the book, there was this tricky, hard part about being an elected official and a lawyer and not wanting to give legal victories to the far right as much as I would have wanted to stand up for a moral victory for the far left. But you know that when they get these legal victories and you're not following this very forbidding labyrinth of Supreme Court case law and First Amendment, that you're likely to give a victory to the far right, which is what happened. One of the worst moments of all this, setting aside what happened on the day when Heather Hauer was killed and other people were brutally injured, was losing that lawsuit. It made me, because we had tried so hard and we had done everything creative that we possibly could. And that's why when I look at this, at this toolkit, Mary, it's like, this is exactly what these embattled small cities need, is they need something with 500 footnotes to help them actually pick their way through. We hired Boy Schiller. We clawed $30,000 out of our strategic fund to hire a law firm to overrule our professional staff and try to relocate this rally, and we still lost. And then there was the and it's traumatizing. I think a lot of the city, you know, we had PTSD from absorbing this much anger and sadness and fear and rage and pain. And the book for me was somewhat therapeutic, just in trying to get it all into one place. But then on top of all that, any elected official, you have to have humility, because anything I experienced as a white male mayor in this position paled next to what somebody in the public, you know, somebody who's in a marginalized group, actually having people marching with swastikas, so emboldened in this time and in this city in the South. So you can't, I mean, I have to keep in perspective. I'm fine compared to where a lot of people ended up as a result of this horrific trauma. So that's another challenge, is figuring out how do you deal with trauma while still keeping it in perspective. I met recently with a car attack survivor too, who have not been able to work for over 2 years because they were physically injured on site. That's how traumatized they were.
I just want to thank you for sharing that, because I think that sometimes, you know, in our polite circles, we flatten out the very real horror of this. I mean, it's important that we can talk about this in a kind of a civil and calm fashion. That's important, right? On the other hand, it's important not to flatten out what it is that we are talking about here. We're talking about the fundamental dehumanization of persons who believe that they can do that by force and subvert all of the norms that we have employed in order to create a more civil and humane society going back hundreds of years. And so I just want to thank you for sharing that. And so I want to conclude our event by just asking if each of you would give us a closing thought. And I'm going to give you the choice of, you can either give us some homework or you can give us some hope. You can either tell us what makes you hopeful in the current moment, despite all of the stuff that we're talking about, or you can give us some homework. You can tell us what it is that you think that we should do as we move forward in the current moment, recognizing that our audience is diverse. There are people who are lawyers who do the work that you do. There are people who are journalists who do the work that I do, and people who are presumably just interested and thoughtful people, but just, and who would like to go first? George, thank you. I was hoping you would go first. So thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for this excellent kind of facilitation of concepts and kind of weaving it together like it needed to be done. And I appreciate your facilitation here. I'll choose hope over homework, just because I am not a good student writ large, but like I'll choose hope. and I'll just share a very brief thought, which is, you know, this conversation today, lawyers, advocacy organizations, journalists, mayors, concerned citizens coming together. In my quote in the press release for this exact event today, I describe civil society as the safety net that's needed for these actions. As someone, along with Mary and a number of other folks on this call, who spent a number of years working in the federal government, I don't care if you're a Democrat, I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care what your ideology is. If you have to wait for the Department of Homeland Security or Justice or the FBI or the State Department to come in and solve your city or your municipality's problems, it's too late. Locally, we need to bring communities together. Locally, civil society actors and concerned citizens like Georgetown Law, like the mayor of a city, like a law firm, like these are the safety nets that are going to come in. And increasingly with toolkits like this and memoirs like Mike's that are the lessons learned, this is making the new roadmap for how to prevent this type of horrific action like we saw in Charlottesville and like we've seen it elsewhere take place. And I'm really heartened to, you know, get to know Raúl a little bit and hear about what's happening on the other side of the country. These are the best practices and lessons learned, in my view, that will be the roadmap for civil society and for communities helping bring groups together, not tear them apart.
George Selim is the Senior Vice President of Programs at the Anti-Defamation League. George, thank you so much for being here today. Who wishes to go next?
I'll go.
Okay.
Mary, you wanna lead?
Go ahead, Mike.
No, I'll give Mary the last word.
Yes. So I would actually go to homework, although maybe cheat and like loop in a tiny little bit of hope. So we started a project after Charlottesville. The ADL was the home of this, and the Fetzer Institute, the Charles Koch Institute, a really interesting coalition joined, including ICAP, to bring people together in 2 summits of public and private sector leaders to try and learn and share wisdom and best practices for this incredibly difficult work of dealing with extremism. So anyone out there, I sent it on the chat, but if you go to overcomingextremism.org, there's a final report there which represents dozens, if not hundreds, of promising interventions in, like, the city of Providence deciding to call itself a city of kindness, or the lessons that came out of the Charlottesville government's independent review that we hired a law firm to do to come up with best practices for how to prevent this kind of conflict, setting aside things like anti-militia litigation. And I just wanted to, these are the conversations that I've had over the last week. A mayor from a city that was faced with a clash between a far right group and a far left group called me, who had read the book, and we talked for 45 minutes, and I said, there are real specific pointers: physical separation between the groups, tabletop exercises of all the leading officials who can walk through and rehearse what's going to happen, communication with all groups as much as possible before, during, and after. Don't get into turf battles. That's where tear gas is used a lot of the time when one group refuses to back down, as opposed to waiting and letting time do some work. Prepare for the aftermath, work with stakeholders, faith groups to have strategies for healing and reconciliation. A lot of lessons like this come out of, as awful as things were in Charlottesville. So I do believe, you know, I've wrestled all these years with whether I'm an optimist about democracy's ability itself to overcome its own worst enemies. And this is coming from within. And I still believe in democratic resilience and in innovation. The work has gotten harder over the last few months, even since the book came out. But that's why what is being talked about right now is so crucial. It's actually about rule of law, taking the measure of this new set of challenges coming from within society, with the president throwing fuel on these flames all the time and still saying, we can tackle this, and we can tackle it using 200-year-old laws. So that's the homework, is to look at the research that we have done. And I think the biggest thing is these groups. Oh, and read my book. It's at michaelsigner.com if you're interested. There's actually a Kindle special this month. It's like $2.99, so it's very affordable. And I think people should roll up their sleeves and get to work. I think that the new country that we're going to build, you know, the biggest gift to authoritarianism is cynicism. and it's throwing up your hands. And if you look at the history of when authoritarian countries have grown out of democracies, it's when regular people and leaders say, this is too hard, I'm going to give up, it's too overwhelming. And this has happened before. But on the other hand, we have seen before also the United States of America roll up the sleeves, figure out how to conquer its own worst demons. And I think that's why what we have just heard is so totally crucial at this existential moment.
Michael Signer served as the mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia. He is the author, as he told you, of Cry Havoc, which describes his experience before and during the Unite the Right rally of 2017. He's currently the Vice President and General Counsel of an independent digital design agency. Mr. Mayor, Michael Signer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'm going to give the last word to Mary McCord, but before I do, I just want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank all the staff who helped put this together, whose names you don't know and who you don't see, but without whom this event would not have taken place. So thank you all for that and for your hard work in sort of putting this together. I want to mention we also heard from Raúl Torrez, who's the District Attorney of Bernalillo County, New Mexico, and Steven Schulman, who's the pro bono partner at Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. And Mary, why don't you give us a final thought here? Mary McCord is the legal director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. She's a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and a former acting assistant attorney general for national security. So Mary, a final thought from you, if you would.
Sure. I think this conversation's been particularly important during this very polarized time in our country's history. I mean, we've certainly had polarized times in the past, but in recent years, I think we're at one of the peaks. And we are in an election season, and we are in a situation where people need to not only be able to freely protest peacefully, they also need to be able to feel like they can freely go to the polls and exercise their voting rights. And so I maybe because I had a career as a prosecutor and I sometimes look at the glass half empty instead of half full, I worry for how the next several months will be, particularly with this rise of militia activity and intimidation that could be really have an impact on our upcoming election, in addition to the impact it's already happened on protest activity. So the hope part and the homework part of what I want to say is that by nearly 300 people RSVPing for today's event, people are interested, people are concerned. There are people who are tuning in from all over the country. Take what you've heard back to your communities. Work with your local officials, work with your activist groups to make sure that constitutional rights, First Amendment, voting rights, that these things are going to be protected against the threats of violence that we've been seeing. And then secondly, this is a toolkit of legal tools. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for a very long time. I litigate. That's what I know to do. But that's a Band-Aid because the polarization is coming from a different place. There's got to be a reason why white supremacist groups and the militias that support them do what they do. They are afraid of something. They need to have a better understanding that the more we equalize the playing field in this country, the more we try to make amends for a history of structural racism and try to ensure that people of all colors, all religions, all people in this country will have opportunities, that shouldn't be seen as a threat to the white nationalists. It should be seen as a way that everyone can benefit. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a lawyer. I want to support those conversations, but that's the next step. I can do what I can do. ICAP, the Law Firm Coalition, others can do what they can do to try to protect public safety, but this country has got to have a deep conversation about how we correct the structural racism in this country and how it benefits everyone.
Mary McCord, thank you so much for joining us. Thank all who participated in this conversation about political violence, extremism, and American democracy. We are at the end of our time, so I want to thank everyone for participating. I do want to remind everybody we are still in the middle of a global health crisis, so wash your hands and do everything that you need to do to stay safe so that we can live to fight another day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle, for doing this. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. I'm good.